And to remind you that we are recording this and it'll be available for you. My name is Nancy Ramsay. I'm privileged to serve as the director of the center. And we offer these webinars September through May. And we are delighted to do that and able to do that in collaboration with the VOA Center, which is directed by Rita Nakashima-Brock, the founding director of the Soul Repair Center here at Brite before she joined the program at VOA. Today's webinar features military moral injury in the UK and the Netherlands, learning from the experience of military personnel serving in this context. This webinar provides an opportunity to learn from a British chaplain who has served in multiple contexts, including Scotland, Afghanistan, and South Sudan, a chaplain from the Netherlands, and a former U.S. Air Force officer currently doing research and teaching about moral injury at the International Center for Moral Injury in the UK. Our panelists bring active duty combat experience, deep involvement in supporting veterans, and familiarity with the issues of moral injury. Their presentation will include attention to how military moral injury in their context is shaped by the experiential legacy of world wars on the soil of the UK and the Netherlands, the influence of increasing secularization in the chaplaincy, the challenges of sexual violence, racism, and moral injury in the UK and the Netherlands, and current strategies to address suicide in the military in the UK and the Netherlands. Beginning in order of their conversation, Brian Powers, PhD, is the inaugural William Bernard Van Fellow in Christianity and the Armed Forces at Durham University in the United Kingdom, a former Special Operations Weather Team officer in the U.S. Air Force, and a veteran of conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Brian is a systematic theologian and the author of Full Darkness, Original Sin, Moral Injury, and Wartime Violence. He has written and presented extensively on the resonances between Augustinian doctrines of sin and moral injury at international gatherings of religious and anthropological scholars, and has published several articles in academic and religious journals, exploring, cultivating, and sharing resources of recovery. Brian is an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church, USA. The Reverend Nicola Frail, CF, serves as chaplain to Defense Medical Services at the Defense Medical Academy, which provides military medical education and training for the Royal Navy, Army, and Royal Air Force personnel. She provides pastoral care and spiritual support to personnel. She was commissioned in 2012 as a full-time Army chaplain, and in 2014 deployed to Afghanistan as the Kabul Support Unit chaplain. In 2017, she served in South Sudan as part of the UN mission there. She has also served at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst and as senior chaplain with 1st Armored Infantry Brigade. She has studied at the University of Aberdeen, holds an MBA from the University of Denver, and an MDiv from San Francisco Theological Seminary. She earned an MTH from Cardiff University. She serves as convener for the Royal Army Chaplains Department Moral Injury Community of Interest, and is a member of the steering group for the International Center for Moral Injury and a trustee of Veterans Chaplaincy Scotland. Sanneke Brouwers is a chaplain in the Dutch Army. A Roman Catholic, she has served several units in the Dutch Army, as well as one of its military schools. She is pursuing a PhD in practical theology entitled Experiences of Moral Distress in the Military Context. Her present duties include providing care for veterans outside active duty, education, presentations at commemorations, and being available to veterans in various settings. She served in several units of the Dutch Army at Incirlik Air Base, USA, in Adana, Turkey, a Patriot air defense setting, and during 2013-2014, as a chaplain, she serves to assist veterans with the emotional burdens of moral injury and to establish recognition on the part of society for veterans' experience of moral injury. We look forward to learning from them, and following their presentation and our conversation together, mine with them, at the top of the next hour, we will invite your comments and engage in the questions that you pose in the chat, which my colleague Kyle Fauntleroy will be monitoring. We are also looking forward to the opportunity to learn from your questions and your observations. But now let's begin by learning from our colleagues, beginning, I think, with Brian. And Brian, I think we decided we would start off with you and with the conversation about the experiential legacy of world wars on European soil. Certainly a difference that our colleagues there bring than we here in the United States. So would you share more about how that informs the work of chaplaincy in these three countries, or the two countries? Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Nancy. Absolutely. I'm happy to share a little bit about that. I just want to make a quick note, perhaps at the outset, that I feel like my role here is something of a cultural translator, in that I moved to the UK about 5.5 years ago. So, as many of you who've lived in perhaps two different cultures, or had many of the awkward conversations that I've had, there's plenty of times where there's difficulty because someone you're talking to is used to doing something their way, you're used to doing it your way. And in those conversations, you realize, I don't know what I don't know, and the other person I'm talking to doesn't know what I don't know. And it can become very difficult to figure out where our footing is in each place. So I wanted to say, in terms of the experiential legacy of the wars on European soil, one of the things that I found really powerful when I first arrived here in the UK, I arrived in September, so just a few weeks before November 11th, 2018, which is here in the UK is Remembrance Day, in the US Veterans Day, one of the shared legacies that commemorate the end of the First World War. In the US, I used to always joke Veterans Day meant you could get a free cup of coffee and a free meal several different places. And that was, as a veteran, that was valuable. It also meant encouraging those veterans who didn't have access to much, that they could do those things on that day as well. But here in the UK, there's a real sense in what Remembrance Day is at that moment of loss. And it's extensive public ritual where on the 11th, for example, there's always a Remembrance Day service on the 11th. There's always a Remembrance Day service on the Sunday following, Remembrance Sunday. And one of the really powerful moments in that, there's 2 minutes of silence observed at 11 o'clock on Remembrance Day. And by that 2 minutes of silence is 2 minutes of silence. People come out of shops, activity stops. In Durham, everyone comes out on lines the main street, and you sit and observe 2 minutes of silence. There's a palpable sense of loss, and it's a cultural space for grief that is really, really poignant. And to me, one of those things that sticks out is as a difference in the US, where we tend to celebrate military activities, even in the ones that are somewhat somber, they tend to have a somewhat relaxed celebratory nature to it. That's not the case at all on Remembrance Day. Part of that, I think, is the different legacy between the amount of loss suffered. The First War saw the UK lost 900,000 people, an entire generation, and that really echoes in its remembrances and its rituals. So just to note that, I think, is something really starkly different, perhaps to open our conversation, and I'll certainly let Nicola and Sanneke expand on that.
Yeah, I think there's still relative proximity for us to the Second World War. That generation, not with us in as great numbers as would have been the case, even 5 or 10 years ago. I'm sitting close to the Garrison Church, where I currently am posted, and you'll see the backdrop to where I'm sitting is St. George's Garrison Church, and that speaks of that sense of legacy that Brian alluded to, and how we choose to remember. This church is perhaps a little distinctive, that if you were to look in the opposite direction, you would actually see an American flag. That's very unusual to see that, but it speaks of the numbers of soldiers, American soldiers, who came through this particular location during the Second World War. and how their sacrifice and service is remembered here alongside British personnel that have served too. So for us, very normal to see the standards hanging, as you can see behind me, but also there's a sense of the legacy and the way that we remember is quite literally inscribed on the walls. And so probably too small for you to see, but in gold on the wooden panels are the names of those who have died in various conflicts. And that is not just a legacy going back to First or Second World War. It is also the names of those who have died more recently. And so there are the names of those who have died in Bosnia and Iraq and Afghanistan, in Northern Ireland. So in these more recent conflicts, names are still inscribed on the walls and in books of remembrance as well. And this is very particular to our military context. And perhaps something that those outside the armed forces don't see so much. But as Brian's alluded to, there's a continuing legacy and I think an appreciation for the sacrifices that were made by different generations, and perhaps with particular focus on the Second World War, of stories that have been passed down, and this being still something that children in school will learn about. So they will learn about the poppies and the meaning behind that, something of the history. And yet we're shifting, I think, within the UK as well, in terms of how we remember and also what we remember. So this going beyond remembering those who have sacrificed, both in a military but also in a civilian context. And I think that for us is really important when a war has been fought, as it were, on our own shores, and cities were bombed, children were evacuated. So this was something that was that nobody was left untouched by. And involved in some shape or form, whether that was serving in uniform or whether it was somebody who was involved, as it were, in the war effort at home. There is a sense that everybody played their part and did that in very different ways. And so there is, I think, this sense of gratitude that exists and that is marked in the way that Brian has described. I'll be interested to hear from Sanneke what that's like in the Netherlands. I suspect, that's different again.
Yes, okay, thank you. I think the Netherlands does not have a military culture like the US and the UK. In the Great War, the Netherlands were neutral, and in the Second World War, it took only some days before the Netherlands were taken over by the Nazis and our royals flew to England. And we depend on our allies for our freedom to end the war. And I'd like to add that we are, until present days, still are very grateful for that. Remember this every year at our Remembrance Day, which is in May, so we remember and celebrate the end of the Second World War, not the First World War. And that day we honor our liberators, and often we have some guests from the US also at that days. After the Second World War,
Sam, there you go.
no, it's good.
Sanneke, there we go.
Yes, there we are. I don't know what happened. Maybe, I don't know. After the Second World War, Europe believed in no more war. And since the Cold War, there have only been cutbacks in the armed forces. But since the war in Ukraine, we woke up from this dream. And again, we have a great war on our continent for 2 years now. This means the Netherlands starts to feel the need for defense and be prepared for threats. But again, we are looking up to our big brothers to ensure safety. And we can also see the legacy of the Second World War in the present conflicts, like, for example, in Israel and Palestine, because there's always been a strong connectedness between the Netherlands and Israel after the Second World War. But people in the Netherlands are now also concerned about the use of force against children and civilians in Gaza. This conflict makes clear how the legacy of the World Wars influences the European vision in different ways. Because I like to add, the German position is different from the Dutch. Germany is more careful to criticize Israel in this conflict. And with regard to Ukraine, the German peace movement protests against army supplies. They intend to be more pacifistic. And I don't want to simplify these global difficult questions. I just try to illustrate how the legacy of the World Wars is different in both our countries and Europe. I'd like to add also something about recognition, if it's appropriate now, because I feel this is very important for veterans, but it's ambiguous. From scientific research, we know that 80% of the Dutch civilians appreciate veterans, but only 30% of the veterans feel recognized. And Dutch veterans look up to veterans in the UK and the USA because they think they get more appreciation, expressed often in the words, "Thank you for serving." And the Dutch veterans miss this. And I think the absence of the military culture is very different from the Anglo-Saxon culture. And this difference is rooted in our role during the World Wars on our continent. Maybe it's also the secularization, we can speak about this later. But the Dutch society is not communitarian, not patriotic, and the army is not very present in civil life. And I want to illustrate this with two examples. When a Dutch soldier is at a gas station in a uniform, a civilian will not say to him, "Thank you for serving," but "How was your vacation with my tax money?" Which is an insult, but it happens. The second example is when Dutch farmers want to show their dissatisfaction with government policy, they put the Dutch flag upside down all around the country to show their dissatisfaction, which is also an insult for veterans. So I think this can illustrate how the military culture is more or less absent in the Netherlands.
Well, those summaries were certainly helpful. And now let me ask you if you can build on that and focus in a bit more on issues of secularization and the challenges that arise in care among this increasingly secular military personnel. Brian, why don't, since you've got a view from both countries or from their context and ours, why don't you lead off with this, and then we can hear from our colleagues, Nicola and Sanneke.
Sure. So just a couple things again in framing this idea of secularization. Certainly, the UK, much like the US and in most of Europe, we know there's increasingly fewer people identifying as Christian upon kind of year-upon-year surveys in the last few decades, and certainly attending Sunday worship services here in the UK. And at the same time, in many places in Europe and certainly in the UK, there still exists a state church and the structure of that, which marks a very different kind of framing in terms of how we understand religion and secularization than in the US, where there is no such structure, which presents a particular way of talking and being in that space. As Nicola noted, and you can actually see in her background, the standards that fly behind her in the church. This is a fascinating tradition and a part of UK culture. It represents that, some idea, at least from my view, of shock for Americans. It was shocking to me to see, military standards hanging up in a church where they're left literally to just kind of rot away within the church, but also very respectfully hung and put there, knowing that they will over time kind of pass away. It's a fascinating tradition, but also represents to me a function of the state church in the UK, which is, of course, the Anglican Church. And I won't get into the differences between the Church of Scotland and everything like that. This is going to get really confusing. Sorry, Nicola. We share that tradition, so I feel like I can say that. Where there's no formal separation from the institution of government, the monarch is the head of the church, and thus it does also serve a function not simply as a Christian church, but as something of the religious expression of the United Kingdom and the institution in which that's expressed in many ways. If you watch perhaps from the States, the coronation of King Charles, you saw that in the example. We had people of different faith traditions come and pray and offer different things during that coronation in Westminster Abbey, kind of under the larger umbrella of the expression of faith of the United Kingdom. In that, those ideas that there are memorials to military units within churches, the holidays in the UK, which are strictly observed, even though they have somewhat of a secular influence, are still based very deeply on religious traditions. Remembrance Day is held, those services are held within the church, and there's still a way in which, despite the secularized nature of life in the UK, that is still, that religious space and that Christian space still has a strong foothold. Today is, for example, Shrove Tuesday, or more commonly known Pancake Day. My kids are literally feasting, having a pancake feast this evening. In a very, feels like a very uniquely British thing for me. But I think that just that framing device makes secularization certainly a thing, but there are interesting footholds of religious traditions in Europe that I think occur in a different capacity that the US might not recognize as easily. Nancy, I think you're still on mute there, sir.
Yes, I'm not now. So either Nicola or Sanneke, whichever of you wishes to go next and talk about this matters of issues of secularization, that would be great.
I think to pick up on what Brian was saying about his observations around remembrance, I think it's worth mentioning how that is shifting within a military context specifically. We know that on the national picture for us, we know from census data, so we have national census every 10 years. So we know from the two most recent census that there is a shifting picture. We see that within our churches, but on a more broad level, we know that the number of people who identify as being non-religious has increased markedly over the last 10 years. By the same token, the number of people who identify as Christian has declined significantly. And we've also seen a marked increase in the number of Muslims in the census data. Now, that percentage overall is still very small relative to the total population, but within that particular cohort, the increase is very significant. And within an environment now where in the armed forces, there is a lot of attention given towards diversity and inclusion, and a recognition of this changing picture within British society in terms of religious makeup, those who identify as not considering themselves to be religious, maybe spiritual. We know that there are many, many subcategories that sit under a non-religious umbrella, and it's quite difficult for us at the moment to disentangle. And so to say what percentage of people might identify as atheists compared to humanists, somebody who might say, well, actually, I don't subscribe to any organized religion, but I still think of myself as a spiritual person. And I don't think we're in a place quite yet where we're able to really to say with any degree of certainty how those numbers really break down. What we can see, certainly within our military context, is a change in policy, which is affecting practice. And specifically around remembrance, that policy has now changed. So in my time of serving, initially I would have automatically, I would have officiated at a Christian act of remembrance. That is no longer the case. And so the act of remembrance itself is mandated to be non-religious. Now, that doesn't preclude a chaplain who is Christian or a Jewish chaplain from offering prayers or a service in addition to the act of remembrance, but it will be a separate matter. And so chaplains now have an opportunity to be creative, I might say, in how they still are using. So in my case, I'll be drawing very strongly from Church of Scotland liturgy and shaping that in a way that can be or is inclusive, creating a space for reflection. And that may be an invitation for those who wish to pray in silence into that space. Other chaplains may choose to do this quite differently and have a time of prayer afterwards. But for us, there are core elements within the act of remembrance that are consistent from year to year, and we might say from generation to generation, in terms of some of the wording that is used, last post and the 2-minute silence and reveille. The laying of wreaths. So those are really our core elements when we say act of remembrance. That's just what we're really talking about. And even within the chaplains department, as we've gathered most recently for our Memorial Days, so when we're remembering our own chaplains who have died, that our own act of remembrance also was non-religious and followed by a short contribution from our chaplains of different faiths within the department as it stands currently. This was preceded by a Christian service in the chapel for those who wish to attend. So there was a sense of us coming together, and I think in our framing of this, saying our diverse voices, our unified thanks in gathering together for remembrance. So we're seeing very specific changes in our practice. And this calls for flexibility and adaptability, I think, on the part of our chaplains as we respond to this. Might be very different from the Dutch position, I think, Sanneke.
Yes, and also not, because I recognize what you say about people identify themselves, for example, as non-religious, but also feel there is something transcendent. So it's very difficult to put people in a box, because it's ambiguous. And I think it's true, the Netherlands are a very secularized country, and in chaplaincy we have 7 denominations. And maybe this is also something special for you. So we have the Roman Catholics, the Protestants, the Humanists, which is not the same, I believe, as the non-religions you were speaking about, Nicola, because the Humanist also is a denomination, the Hindu, the Muslim, and the Buddhist, and we are working together. But also we have this, in the end, we have the same task in supporting soldiers, taking care for their well-being, moral education, and provide religious service or moments of reflection for the Unist people. Every unit has their own embedded chaplain, but if a soldier wants a chaplain of a different denomination, this is always possible. So for us, the fundament of our position is the Dutch separation of church and state, which I believe is very strong. So I think it would not easily happen in a Dutch church to have flags or to have some military ceremonies, or it's not intertwined, the politics and the church. And the advantage of that is that the chaplain has a very independent role and a guarantee of confession secret. So we are not in the military hierarchical line, but just in the ecclesiastical line, which means I can never be forced for anything by the military command. And this is very important for the work of the chaplains. So we are not soldiers, but they call a civilian in a uniform, because we will address the human in the military role. The secularization starts in the Netherlands after the Second World War, and the churches began to lose control over social life. In Dutch, we call it depillarization. And pillarization, I don't know if the word is common for you, but it means religion, education, media, sport, politics are all within a specific denomination organized. So that's not the case anymore. And until today, also in the Netherlands, the churches are shrinking. But of course, there are also still practicing believers and a very lively Christian communities. And Christianity still influences our politics, our cultures, our values, our media. And in my observation, secularization does not mean that faith will disappear. And I consider soldiers to be possessed with a very religious feeling. Because of the work, they struggle with questions about good and bad, the feeling of being guided by something transcendent, and the meaning of human life. And it means that during deployment, also non-religious soldiers do attend services of the chaplain from whatever denomination. So the soldiers that never go to church or anything in home, from their homes, they do go to the services when they are deployed, because it also gives a feeling of a community. And I believe that secularization in the Dutch society also means the disappearing of community. And the armed forces are, for us, almost the only source for community. So when civilians enter as autonomous individuals in modern times, they are formed by the army into part of the group. And when they leave service, they will not forget the comradeship, because it's very precious for them. And I think it's important. This is an important role also for the armed forces to bring this community in society.
You all are raising a lot of issues I'm looking forward to us delving into in a moment. But I want to move on to the point you have invited for discussion about issues of exclusion in military culture, such as gender, race, in groups and out groups. Brian, you might want to lead off, because you've got a particular angle on this, and then we can and hear from the others.
Sure, and here certainly I want to let Nicola and Sanneke speak of details, but one thing that I can say to this is, moving here was a very big reminder very early that issues of race and gender and in-groups and out-groups are very differently constructed in different societies. I think in the US we tend to think, for example, that our own understanding of race and those tensions there must be the same or very similar in other places. And one thing I found very quickly was that it's not. I was used to navigating some of those systems and some of those tensions, at least recognizing it and socially locating myself. When I came to the UK, one of the things that was fascinating, on the first weekend I was here, for example, there was a headline in the newspaper that I was reading that was talking about a racial hate crime. And there's pictures of two people on the front of the paper. And I look at the two of them, and my initial thought is just general confusion. I was like, to me, these are both white guys. Like, I don't understand the victim and the perpetrator. I would be hard pressed to tell you who was who and what was the difference. And to me, to come, reading into it and then studying further, realizing one person was an Irish traveler, the other a resident of England who had some connections to various different groups, and that's how they thought it was established as a hate crime. But just to note that those barriers break down in very different ways, even within the UK, even in other parts of Europe, different societies do that in vastly different ways. Those tensions exist, sometimes not even among the primary fault lines that we understand in the US in terms of race or in gender, but one that I'm sure Nicola will speak some to in the UK is just social class still remains an incredibly strong in-group, out-group divider here, in a way that is very difficult to translate into American culture. And that comes from the complexity of the history that obviously marks that, as it does in so many places here. And Sanneke has already pointed that out in a few ways, how that works in the Netherlands. Just as perhaps a final note there, yeah, to emphasize how this works. In my first week at Durham University, I was teaching, in preparation, I should say, to teach my first class with undergraduates. I was told, make sure you encourage folks with northern accents to speak out, because the conversation can get dominated quickly by those with southern English accents. And I remember being utterly horrified because I had no capacity to distinguish the two different kinds of the two accents that were being talked about. And I think that because those two, again, reflect a social divide that was not understood well by me. So just to kind of note those ways in which in-groups and out-groups are constructed, even along the lines that many of us in the US are very familiar with, are very, very different, and very, very quickly, depending on where you are in the UK and Europe. I'll let Nicola and Sanneke expand where they see fit there.
Nicola.
Yeah, my accent certainly will say something about where I come from, although on occasion I have been, I was going to say use the word accused, I do not mean this disparagingly to anybody who is Canadian, but have been accused of speaking like a Canadian because of having spent so much time in the States. But very often our accents say something about the communities that we have come from. And sometimes that is certainly connected to class, and within the armed forces, historically, officers tended to come from better off families. And in majority of cases historically, were also privately educated in terms of their secondary education. Whereas a large number of our soldiers recruited from communities, in some cases, communities of social deprivation. And this, I think, has shifted to some degree over time. It has certainly shifted in terms of those who are coming in to train as officers now, that there is a much broader, a much more diverse group than would have been the case a generation or two ago. And so social issues, there is some overlap, I think, between here and the US, certainly within a military context. And I think, for me, I wanted to lift up really two independent government reviews that have taken place over the last few years that speak to historical injustice and also to current concerns. And so the first of those being the Etherton report. This was published last year, and it looked into the experience of LGBTQ veterans between 1967 and 2000, during a time where there was a ban on serving in the armed forces. So it wasn't just a question of an unjust policy. There were also questions in terms of the manner in which that policy was enforced, which was very traumatizing for many LGBTQ veterans. And that has unquestionably been a source of moral injury for some veterans. And so there is a bit of a journey now with public recognition of the harm that has been caused to a particular community of veterans. A public apology by the Prime Minister in the House of Commons, more questions in terms of restitution, but at a very practical level. People were essentially, people had joined, wanted to have full careers. In some cases, then they were unable to continue to serve. And it wasn't simply a case of leaving, but they also, in some cases, had to return their medals. And so there were symbols of their service also, which were denied to them as well. So there is a legacy there, I think, within a particular cohort within our veterans community. And we're in a place now where perhaps there wasn't such an awareness amongst the general public of this, but a greater awareness now following the publication of the report last year. And then in addition to that, there was also a report published in 2021, very similar name, so not to confuse, so Etherton Report and Atherton Report. And so the Atherton Report related to the experience of women in the armed forces. They interviewed over 4,000 women. So some who were veterans and some serving, combination. And 64% of the female veterans and 58% of those who were serving reported bullying, harassment, or discrimination of some kind during their careers. And yet alongside that, almost 90% who engaged with the inquiry also said that they would recommend a career in the armed forces. So really interesting to see those two statistics alongside. And I have to say, you know, from a pastoral perspective, I have certainly supported female personnel who have expressed anger and shame as a result of their experiences, and have seen some women who have been very bright and capable really lose confidence in themselves as a result of experiences that they have had. That is a minority in my experience, but nonetheless, it's very sad to encounter situations like that. And speaking from an army perspective, there have been some significant changes in recent years, I think worth holding up. So the first of these, the creation of a serious defense serious crimes unit. This takes cases out of the chain of command in essence, which was not formerly the case. We also now have an unacceptable sexual behaviors policy, which came into being in the tail end of 2022. And there is a presumption now of discharge. So mitigating and aggravating factors will be considered, but there is a presumption of discharge where there has been unacceptable sexual behavior. And so quite a significant change. And also an army-wide change in that we have something called op teamwork. And so now on 3 different occasions, the army has had an army-wide stop for a day. So unless somebody is deployed or on essential duties, the entire army stops and looks at videos and sits down and has small group discussion, has some freedom in how they shape this day, but it is specifically looking at culture and behaviors and how we can look more closely at ourselves and work to be a better, more diverse organization that is respectful of people who may be very different from us. So we're recognizing that we are a work in progress, but I think something very distinctive, and that we would do this as an entire army, choosing to stop and to be very intentional about focusing on culture and behaviors. So with that, I think I'll hand over to Sanneke.
Yes, work in progress, that's exactly what it is, I think. And I believe the movements of Me Too and Black Lives Matter, the woke movement, is also influencing the defense forces. And for me, I believe it's the other side of being in a community. The dark side of the community is that people are also excluded. It's very important to speak about it, because I feel I think we are more aware of institutional racism, sexism, and it's important to speak about it. So I recognize the reports you're mentioning, Nicola, and also the Netherlands are doing work on that. Also because unacceptable behavior and sexual harassment, racism are sources for moral injury, not only between peers, but also in the misuse of power. And I know soldiers who have been excluded or bullied that keep very bad memories of their deployment because they did not feel safe in the group. And this makes it so harmful in the army. They feel the enemy is not outside, but within the group. And this causes feelings of betrayal and is very morally injurious. But feelings of shame about this pitiful position makes it very difficult to speak about their experience because they don't want to come out for their bad position. And I believe the military culture works with normative images, and this is also a factor because soldiers need to be masculine and strong. And this is difficult for some military personnel, and I always use the example of Rambo. I think you recognize it, because people who do not resemble Rambo, they have difficult times. For example, women, because they are seen as a bad version of the male norm. And for women, there are two options. Either you try to become a man, and these women act at the same sport level and behave more masculine than men. And the second option is to behave in stereotypically feminine manner, surfing, charming, soft. And these women are unable to act in their professional role and are vulnerable for sexual unacceptable behavior. So I observe it as a role conflict between the gender role and the professional role. And I'm mentioning this because the role conflict is the topic of my PhD. Because as a soldier, you might be confronted with conflict of values, of a troubled conscience. And this experience can become a burden of moral injury. And in my PhD research, in my approach, I consider moral injury as the result of a role conflict between the personal and the military role, and both with different value systems. And according to the topic of unacceptable behavior, I believe we need to adapt the professional role model to what we need in today's armed forces. So the role model of Rambo is not enough. He cannot do it alone. Or to say it, also Batman needs Robin. Another thing I've learned from the American military socialist Charles Moscas, that the Netherlands are a good example of the postmodern army in having female soldiers, acceptance of gay people, and nowadays we even have transgender people among the military personnel. And yes, I wanted to show a picture also about how it works, because in Amsterdam every year we have the Gay Pride event, and also our highest general was present there this year to underline their support for diversity and inclusion. So that's an example. The Netherlands have the ambition to increase the figure of female military personnel to 30%, but we still have to work on that because it's now around 10%, and I think it's the same in your countries. And around 13% has a migration background. Another example, a recent example from a Dutch female 2-star general, because she recently caused a small riot when she decided to stop wear her tie. So she removed her tie. She stated that if we want to attract more young women, we must stop asking them to wear men's clothes, because the design of the uniform is not comfortable for women's bodies. We don't have numbers about LGBTQ people, of course, because in 1987 came new selection forms where the question according to sexual orientation had been deleted. But I want to end to say that to make women, homosexuals, and colored people accepted and visible, we need a long-term effort. Because the situation of sexual violence and racism are very harmful and traumatizing, because it denies someone on who he or she is as a person and as a soldier.
Thank you very much for that. We're to our last category, and we have about 12 minutes. Let's see how we can do with this, and maybe infringe a bit on the conversation time to allow you all to interact with each other for a bit. But you too apparently struggle with issues of suicide in the armed forces in your countries. And I want to invite Nicola and Sanneke, if you would help the audience um, imagine different frameworks of duties of care and so forth that relate to this problem and other mental health care issues that arise. I guess we'll start with you, Nicola, and then go to Sanneke.
Okay. Yeah, so we have a particular framework in place to support people who we identify as being potentially very, very vulnerable. And that may include somebody who has expressed suicidal ideation, or where there has been a suicide attempt, or indeed it may be a very different set of circumstances. We have something called VRM, which is vulnerability risk management. And this acts as a tool to enable us to provide a holistic wrap of care for personnel who are identified as having perhaps one or a number of risk factors that might make them vulnerable over either a shorter period or over an extended period of time. And what this means in practice is that there is a conversation between the commanding officer, who takes advice from the medical officer, from the unit welfare officer, from the chaplain, perhaps from somebody from within the chain of command, to make a decision whether to add somebody to this risk register, if you will. And there are certain circumstances in which there is a mandatory inclusion when we come into the territory of suicidal ideation or a suicide attempt, and for specific mandated initial periods of time. What this also does is formalizes what we would call a CAP, a care assessment plan, which is put in place for that individual. They are assigned somebody who is known as the CAP lead, that individual there to support, and very often there will be support in different from different quarters. That's to say, it might be that the unit welfare officer is supporting the individual, that I, as a chaplain, am meeting with this person on a regular basis. And we're keeping track of what support is being given and when that has been given, and then able to track a person fairly closely over either a short or extended period of time. If we look to the veteran space very briefly, then I would just want to mention Op Courage. Within the context of England specifically, it must be said that we have a number of devolved matters within the UK. And so Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland will not always be uniform in the way that we do business. But certainly within the English context, we have a specialist referral service for veterans, for reservists, and those who are leaving the military, who can access additional mental health support. And so that is something that is has relatively recently been put in place. We also have a number of charities as well who will support veterans, and one or two very specific around the question of support to families bereaved by suicide. If I think of my time as, for several years until quite recently, chaplain to the Army Widows Association, I found that amongst the widows, that the majority had not been bereaved as a result of their husband's operational experience. It was all manner of different situations. So from accident to illness to operational experience, and of course, including widows who'd been bereaved by suicide as well. And I think within that cohort, and I'd like to think replicated elsewhere, was a sense that it doesn't matter how you are bereaved. We're all in this together as individuals who have been bereaved by any manner of different circumstances. One is not worse than another. There's simply different circumstances This shared sense of solidarity with a common loss, and yet a common loss through a myriad of different circumstances. And so I've been doing some work a little bit with the Royal British Legion for the last 3 years. And we have, in contrast to our formalized acts of remembrance that we've spoken about in November, we have instituted a time for reflection. So a gathering for members from different single service associations, the Widows Associations, for charity, for children as well, and come together and have an opportunity to share in a time of ritual and reflection. There is some degree of participation on behalf of the organizations that are there. And this is done in a non-religious context and in a very informal way. And so it's very different from bands and uniforms with lots of senior individuals present. It is at a very different kind of level with a very different feel and very intentionally something that looks and feels different from the formalities that we've spoken about around remembrance. And we're very keen to particularly reach out to families who have been bereaved by suicide in this space to say, this coming together, which we do at the National Memorial Arboretum, is a place for national remembrance. And we have their memorials from different groups, associations, both military and increasingly civilian as well, alongside each other. And to say, this is a place for you, no matter how you have been bereaved. Here we come together as one with our shared loss. And I think for me, this is a really important addition, something that we've thought through as another step towards healing for people who may be finding very difficult in the midst of bereavement, whether that's fairly recent or whether indeed they have been bereaved, many, many years ago, and continuing to carry a great deal of pain. I'll best hand over, I think, to Sanneke to give us a Dutch perspective.
Yep.
Give us a Dutch perspective.
Thank you.
Yes, I think in active duty we have the same approach as you pointed out, Nicola. So base commanders try to keep an eye on someone if you feel there's something wrong, and of course the chaplain also have a role in that. And also you ended with this. We also have this special cemetery graveyard special for veterans. So not only veterans who are killed during deployment, but any veteran who likes to be buried in the midst of the comrades, they can have a place there in this graveyard. And I tried about suicide. I tried to find some numbers from the Dutch context, but I just found a study that explored the numbers, and the reason for the study was the alarming report from the US. Also to explore this topic in the Netherlands, but the research claims that there are not more suicides among the group of examined soldiers comparing to civilians. And it's hard to say something about it because we really work with very low numbers. We are a small country, we are a small army, so I feel it's very difficult to say something in general about that. So the report says the numbers are not higher than compared to civilians, but still my feeling about this topic is different. And especially among the group of veterans outside active duty, because they're not in the peer group, there are no commanders or chaplains around them to see if there's something wrong. And sometimes I hear a large number when veterans speak about the comrades they lost. So how many people in the group already dead? And also in my pastoral counseling, suicide is a topic in many cases, in maybe most cases. And sometimes veterans just say something like, If I do not wake up tomorrow, this is fine for me. And so it's just a feeling of being tired, but sometimes they are very serious about their death wish. And that does not mean they are committing suicide, but this feeling is very present. And I believe it's very important to express those desolate feelings and to speak about it with these veterans. And I think that being silent about these dark feelings in yourself makes it more lonely and makes you also more vulnerable to suicide. And I'm afraid that most of the veterans that do commit suicide are not in the care system. They do not accept help, or they are isolated, or already invisible and under the radar. But besides the suicide, we often do not know what happened, because I hear more unclear stories of early life ends, motor accidents, heart attacks, people drink themselves to death. Are these also examples of suicide? I don't know, but they can be expression to escape from the situation, or having hard times in carrying their lives. I'd like to end this topic also to say again, if I might, something about recognition, because I feel this is an important key, also considering suicide, because recognition helps veterans to process experiences, and also there I see a thought for chaplains to bridge the gap between society and the military, but also for the society, because I feel we are responsible for our veterans that served our country, not only as a government to organize care programs, but also as civilians to express our esteem for veterans, show them interest, and make them feel home in civil society when they leave service, because I feel there is where the problems start. When veterans leave service, they feel desolate. And we need to encourage them to speak about what they have in mind, because this is the best thing to prevent suicide or other feelings of not well-being, and to prevent them, lock them. Yeah, also they should not lock themselves up into these in-groups again. So I'm searching for connection between the veterans and the society, and make them feel open to speak about experiences. Yes.
That's very helpful. Sam, I wonder if you could bring our participants back, our panelists back, and we'll have a few minutes of just shared conversation among us. Great. That was really helpful. And I have just a few questions from the audience so far. So I want to, first of all, give you a chance. There might have been something you wanted to tag onto that one of the others said, or elaborate, pose another question. So let me first of all see if there are questions you have for one another, or additional thoughts that you want to build on that one of the others shared.
Can I just say one thing,
Sure.
Nancy, to open this? I think just this is prompted by, I think both Nicola and Sanneke's discussion of suicide there at the end and how those are affected in the different places. I just wanted to make a quick note to say there's a few key differences culturally that I think play out in this in a huge way that make a really big difference. One, and the first and most obvious, is access to guns is something that obviously is significantly restricted, if it exists at all, in the UK and European countries compared to the US. We know, for example, that if the suicidal impulse passes, it's quite survivable, and it's actually often, studies and research seem to indicate, a fairly short-lived moment. Obviously, having access to firearms make that a much less survivable moment. So that's a huge impact, and just in terms of how it's viewed. Second is there's certainly the idea of a duty to care, and you're hearing that in both what Nicola and Sanneke are expressing, that permeates all levels of society here in really profound ways. groups, units, organizations, universities, institutions, workplaces are expected to have some level of care for those in their employer, students studying there, or military members, certainly. That's common in the military, but it also transcends the military here in a way that I don't see as much in the US.
Mhm.
Third, the access to care in the NHS in the UK and the different health care systems is so much larger. In Europe, it's so much more easily accessible, despite all the problems that exist in those European systems as well. I think those things just profoundly influence that idea, just to maybe give a tiny bit of helpful background to what Nicola and Sanneke was saying, because those, to me, a lot of those conversations really make sense in the environment of care that's expected, and then within those expectations of care here. And in the US, without that context, it's difficult sometimes to understand that, I think. So just to put that out there quickly.
Okay. Are there other reflections that either of you want to make, maybe in response to what Brian's just said, or to what each other, had to say, or further thoughts?
I think I might just go back to the comment on sort of the cultural difference of being thanked for your service. This is not, in my experience, at all common in the UK. I was pulled aside in the supermarket actually last week. That's the first time that's ever happened to me, where somebody saw me in uniform. I popped into the supermarket to get a couple of things, and somebody just caught my attention and said, I just wanted to, thank you for your service. And I was a little bit taken aback. So that was really the first time that had happened to me. I think one time in a service station, somebody asked, I was in uniform at Costa Coffee, and I was asked, someone said, can I get a coffee for you? And it was in that context of by way of thanks. But I found that to be very, very unusual and atypical in my experience. And so one thing I didn't pick up on was just the way that we express our thanks and gratitude in the UK, and my sense that is shifting from this British stiff upper lip that was very prevalent, particularly up to end of the Second World War, and we see much less of that now. So there's much more conversation around how we feel. We see high-profile figures speaking out about their mental health in a way that, I certainly didn't see, even 10 years ago. So I think there is a cultural shift, and it's a shift within our education systems too, I think, with children who learn to have an emotional vocabulary in primary school in a way that just simply didn't exist, I think, for previous generations. So there is a much greater openness. And I think then that becomes reflected in other ways in which we express how we feel about all manner of different situations. And it's certainly reflected, I think, in a shift in terms of remembrance. And just to come back to suicide very briefly, to say that we don't have a national memorial for veterans who have died by suicide as yet. And so this is something that fundraising is taking place for at the moment. And so memorial planned, named, not yet in situ, but expectation is that will happen in due course at the National Memorial Arboretum that I mentioned earlier. But again, it's indicative of this shift that we're seeing, I think, in British society.
I'll come back to that, but let me see, Sanneke, do you have anything to add to this? We lost you again. While she's coming back, hopefully, that's fascinating. This idea of a memorial for those that. Sanneke, you're welcome to. I'm glad you're there. Can you come? There you go. Are there things you want to add to this now, or in response
Yes,
to Nicola?
it's yeah, because it's nice that you say this. I think it's a Dutch perception about this recognition, and the Dutch veterans hear stories about being applauded when you are in a sports match and there's veteran of the day, and you don't need to be in the line, and you get discount everywhere, all this kind of things, which we don't have very much, and they feel they miss it. But on the other side, I feel the Dutch care system is very good, and this is more important. And the care desk of the Veterans Institute is available 24/7. So it's a perception. I feel it's a perception, but maybe Dutch people did watch too much movies or something like that, and they feel this military proud, and we don't have this military proud, which is, I feel, also rooted in the disaster of Srebrenica. So yeah, this is frustrating for Dutch veterans. And also about this memorial, no, not the monuments. We now have the custom to have the name of veterans. And again, our numbers, we lost 25 soldiers in Afghanistan. That is so few. I know all of them by name. So it's different scale. I want to say this again. So we put the name of the soldiers on bridges or viaducts on the highways as a way to remember them also. So it's a living monument in the common space of our society.
Mm-hmm. Brian, any observations that you want to add?
I'm fascinated. Just, I mean, something Sanneke brought up there about, how do we measure the impact of moral injury in terms beyond, just the statistics of death by suicide, and other things. And it just sparked the thought in me, in COVID, we talked in the UK a lot about excess deaths, that was a statistic that was kind of just something that we'd measure in terms of unquantifiably more people died during this period than normal. So what inferences do we draw from that? Well, that's certainly open, but it sparked, I wonder, as we talk about moral injury, if I haven't seen these kinds of studies, but I'd be fascinated to know if there's the kind of research that measures something like that uses the kind of a statistic that says, well, this isn't a death by suicide, this isn't this kind of thing, but this is a consequence, perhaps one might draw an inference of moral injury or combat trauma was deeply affected a life, and that this is how that it was impacted. I'm interested in that as a concept of measuring this, and I think, again, particularly perhaps that comes out of European contexts where the scale is different and allows us to look at things like that in that capacity. I think that's something really interesting that might be brought from this into an American conversation.
Yes, so we can count the numbers of the Dutch veterans who were in Srebrenica, and this group has large numbers, suicide numbers, I believe. So you're right about the Dutch scale is small, so we can look better on the impact of something. So this is in the case of Srebrenica definitely happening. Yeah.
One of the things that there are a couple of comments that invite questions really that invite, it's along the same theme of how do the older veterans for whom there might have been less attention to some of the forms of difference that you've raised, who see the real changes in some practices of recognition. For example, what sense do you have of tensions in generations of veterans in both the Netherlands and in Britain as they see the changes that you're implementing?
I think that's a really difficult question to answer. When my experience is largely with serving community, rather than interface with veterans. So I think it's fair to say I'm not in a position where I'm seeing or hearing that kind of tension between generations.
It just
Sanneke,
go ahead, Sanneke.
Sanneke, is that different? You know, in the Dutch context, do you?
You mean how veterans experience recognition in general?
Well, the questions have more to do with changes in the culture, really, of the military, and like the ways in which services might be held of recognition in a church where the religious belonging and values have been shifting. So an older veteran might observe these changes and um, find them hard to recognize. So it's a generational question that's raised in a couple of different ways that I'm inviting, because you both are describing substantial shifts in the last decades.
Yes, I think our oldest group of veterans are the ones that went to the Dutch Indies, which was also a very difficult conflict. And also this group were getting the blame when they got back. And so they were silenced and they feel they were perpetrators. And they are silenced and just speak in the in-group. But they also struggled for the veterans care, for organizations, veteran associations. So they did very important work. And for many Dutch people, when you speak about the veteran, they see an old man with blue blazer and a wheelchair. So this is how people look to veterans, the Second World War, the Dutch Indies, and not for young people because the military culture is not present in society. But a big difference with, for example, Afghanistan veterans is that they are not they're not in the role of the perpetrator, but in the role of a hero. So they have much more recognition, and the Netherlands are proud of the effort in Afghanistan. And I feel this mission, Afghanistan, Iraq, is very important for the Dutch military culture after Srebrenica, because there the problem was the army was powerless. So there was military humiliation. You understand? So people, the soldiers feel when they go to Iraq or Afghanistan, they could prove they are strong, they are military, and they could act. And this feelings of powerlessness is very injurious. So yes, there are different groups, and in terms of roles, are you perpetrator, are you a hero, but also are you victim? Is the veteran a patient, someone who is sick or disabled or to be sad about?
Brian, do you want to jump in on any of this?
Well, I was just going to say, I think Sanneke and Nicola are much better placed to talk about the values in particular and how that works than I. But I just want to say there's an interesting way to note that I think moral injury receives a lot of attention in terms of the subjective way in which it affects a person, and that's certainly necessary in terms of identifying if I feel this value is being broken, I feel anger towards this value being disrupted, that's what matters. And certainly that's one way of looking at it. But there's another approach that I think one of the things we're trying to bring out of the center is doing a few studies on exactly when we say the values that are broken, when we talk about Jonathan Shea's betrayal of what's right, or the Lit's definition of moral belief, deeply held moral beliefs being transgressed. Are there commonalities to those? What do we mean by those? How are those shaped? I do think that's a great question in that I don't think we've paid a lot of attention to that aspect of it. There's different understandings of what's right that will shift over time. And certainly it would seem to be that we have to recognize that would cause a significant bit of moral disquiet for those living, kind of at the times where there's an extreme separation between those generations. How does the oldest generation and the youngest generation are going to feel extremely differently about that idea of what's right and what those deeply held moral beliefs are. So that's a real tension within the idea of moral injury that I don't think we pay a lot of attention to yet.
I think there will be some value of conversation, maybe between among the three countries, that is including the U.S. and experiences there. One of the things that I overheard was the increase of religious diversity and preparing chaplains to be responsive to that Buddhist, Jewish, Hindus, humanists, as well as those that identify as Christian. This is I would say that you're a bit ahead of the curve, so to speak, in the United States. That's something that, as I mentioned, we're going to take up more next month. But how do you equip your chaplains to be? I mean, that's a lot of education. How do you equip your chaplains to be responsive to those differences and sufficiently informed about that range of difference?
I think in the operational practice, we are doing the same work. So there's not a big difference between me or the Protestant or the Buddhists. So we do have some military education, and the theological education we already have it before, and the most of the equipment we do together also. Yeah, but maybe again, this is a system of pillarization. If you understand me, if I use the word, so this means we are also in our own pillars of education and church. It are different denominations, so they're really separated, and this is also really separated from the civilian life.
In the United States, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I don't know how to respond on it differently.
Okay. Nicola, do you want to respond to any of that?
Yeah, I think for us, the heart of pastoral care is, person-centered care to an individual, no matter where we're coming from individually. And so we'll have chaplains within denominations and between denominations with widely ranging views and perspectives. We're used to working together, certainly ecumenically and increasingly on a multi-faith basis. And so this picture continues to shift for us. I didn't mention that we're on the cusp, I suppose, of the introduction of NRPOs, so non-religious pastoral officers. And so those will be individuals within the Royal Army Chaplains Department whose endorsing authority will be Humanists UK Non-Religious Pastoral Support Network. And so we are about to enter new territory for us as UK Armed Forces, recognizing that in the Netherlands and in some other countries, this is not unfamiliar territory, but is new for us.
One of the things that I was listening for, and I realized the difference in scale, but also historical differences. But part of what seemed less prominent, though I want to be corrected if I'm wrong, were issues of sexism and racism. And in both cases, the moral injury related to military sexual trauma, most often against male on female, but can also be same-sex trauma. But the point is it's forced. And as we discussed in our December webinar, the failure of the military to adequately address the trauma, the moral injury related to racism in the military in the United States. In fact, it is a source of deep pain, and there isn't yet education for officers, for example, about how to assure that care is taken to address this. So these two, the military sexual trauma and racism, don't seem to be as prominent from your description, but maybe I've missed that.
Yes, I think it's not very prominent, but it, of course, it also does exist. And maybe it does exist on a latent level. And I think it is something institutional. And most of the times the problem is when something is happening, and it could be something small, it's difficult to speak about it. And I hope we can start speak about it on the lowest level, because what always happens in my observation in the armies, when there is sexual harassment or this racism, they start to act in how can I say it? They make it a penalty. You understand? I don't know how to explain. And I would love just to speak about what's happening, how we go along with each other, what's good, what's not good. We have a code how to behave, and we should speak about the behavior and not about the penalties. Because when the penalties are high, in my experience, women don't want to speak about it. They don't want to say there was something wrong yesterday night, or there's a colleague is doing something I don't like, because of this high penalty, and she don't want to she don't want to make it too big. So
Right, to penalize them. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Nicola, it looked like you wanted to say something on this topic as well.
No, it just, yeah, just reflecting on my experience of having lived in the States, I think questions around race and historical legacy are really very different. And so perhaps how that manifests itself within armed forces, to the extent that it does, is also different. It's difficult for me to comment on that per se. It's not something, for me, if I were to take pastoral issues in the round, it's a very, very infrequent pastoral concern that for someone to raise any question around their treatment due to their racial background. It's relatively unusual, but certainly more common, that I would find myself in the position of supporting a woman who has experienced military sexual trauma.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine that the differences in population in terms of racial difference might account for the first point, but
we're talking about, I think already alluded to in terms of percentage, we sit just under 10% in terms of the number of female serving personnel within the army, and that is a percentage that has not changed. So although our total numbers serving within the army have declined, the actual percentage of female serving personnel has remained relatively static over a significant number of years.
Mm-hmm. I want to honor the question from one other participant who he was commenting, Brian, on your mention of the presentation of standards and colors rather, they're laid up in a church consecrated by the archdeacon of the relevant service when presented, so left to return to dust when replaced. And it goes back to the tradition of Saint Martin de Tours and his cloak. And the person is wondering, do you think this will change through secularization? And would it matter to lose this kind of religious history in relation to moral injury? Was this person's question.
Boy, I think Nicola's probably better poised to speak to whether that transition will continue. But I will say, one of the interesting things that, to me, being, like I said, I somewhat joke about my being cultural translator here, in this capacity, in terms of kind of naming things here that are different for an American audience. I gave a talk in Remembrance Day last year that just kind of emphasized, was almost a plea to everybody living in the UK, you may not know how valuable this moment is that you have within your cultural memory, that to preserve it, and it takes preservation. And I'm pleading with you, please, this is such an important place in the cultural memory where we can have conversations about loss and trauma, and where those are invited, and where the public actually attends in a lot of ways with its attention to that. So I think those are valuable. I think the idea that there is something to be lost is probably there, but I might let Nicola speak to how she sees that kind of moving forward.
I think we haven't didn't mention drumhead services. So the standards and the drums coming together and a service in the field or some formal act of worship, and that still exists for now. How we remember, I think, culturally, not just within a military context, but more broadly in society, I think that is shifting. And a good example of that, I think, is in light of COVID, where there was a service in Westminster Abbey in 2022. And in that service, there were trees and saplings which were blessed. I find it hard to imagine that happening a generation ago, maybe even 10 years ago, that would be the case. These trees and saplings were transplanted to the National Memorial Arboretum, to a 25-acre site that has been set aside, in effect, as a memorial site for those who have died during COVID. And so a national place of remembrance, and is intended to be a place for healing and for contemplation, for there to be some kind of continuing legacy as we remember those who died during COVID. So there's a sense in which the national church was involved in terms of that ritual and at an institutional level. And yet when we see what that's going to look like as it's lived out for generations to come, it's going to be in that legacy of something that is very natural and not the stone monuments that we associate typically with the World War II period. So this is something quite distinctively different that we are seeing taking shape.
That's certainly the case. Where here in the United States, a military funeral is still an extraordinarily powerful and ritual experience. And so this is part of, so that continues, I think, as a particularly ritualized expression of respect. And some things probably will continue in that regard over time. But this has been very helpful for us to to talk about some differences and to see some continuities in really remarkably different populations and size of countries and so forth. But I'm very grateful for you all sharing from your deep experience. And Brian, thank you for helping to gather this and offer, you kind of live in two worlds, and you've been able to help us make some connections. So I'm very grateful. And we're going to close this webinar now for our guests. And let's take just a few more minutes for some conversation among us. But the recording will stop now. And I want to thank those of you who have been watching and remind you that the recording will be available in about 10 days. And I hope that you'll return to and share this with others.